See you all here and to welcome you to this third installment of the Anabaptist and Philosophy Roundtable. My name is Marius van Hoogstraten, and I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the Amsterdam Mennonite Seminary. But my seminary is really just a small part of the driving force behind these events that are co-organized by the Division of Biblical and Religious Studies at Fresno Pacific University, the Anabaptist Mennonite Biblical Seminary in Elkhart, Indiana, and Pandora Press, in addition to my own institution. That's right. I wrote this down, Jamie, but it used to be the Institute of Mennonite Studies for the previous two sessions.
And just saying Institute of Mennonite Studies, yeah.
The Institute of Mennonite Studies
at AMBS.
These events that we're now in the third session grew out of a series of more informal conversations that happened between several of us that are now here. And even, I recall, one failed attempt to organize an in-person symposium in Amsterdam. Each of these starting from the sense that Anabaptist and Mennonite theology and studies more broadly sometimes find it difficult to engage with and see the relevance of philosophical inquiry. In our view, philosophy is not just wanton intellectual speculation, but also the reflection on key underlying assumptions of all of our thinking and being in the world. Reflection that we consider deeply necessary, even for an earthy, straightforward tradition that is proud of its simplicity, such as the Anabaptists. So we sought to create a place, even a modest place such as this, where the interactions between Anabaptists and philosophy could be traced. And after an online book presentation in early 2021 that many of us were part of, we figured maybe this is the right format to bring these voices and interests together. So here we are. This is as I said before, this is the third session in the series. To recap very briefly, the first session in early 2022 was a wildly fascinating conversation with Diane Ince on the ambiguous relation to inheritance and tradition, both philosophical tradition and religious tradition, with a response from John Caruana. And in the second session, also in early 2022, we heard from our very own Max Kennel precisely on the more conceptual relationship between Anabaptists and philosophy, with a response from Christian Early. I have pasted, but I believe not everyone was there, that you can see both of those sessions, recordings of both of those sessions, if you would like to. And I've pasted them into the links into the chat. And now the conversation continues. It is therefore, again, my great joy and privilege to now hand the word over to Max, who will lead us into the real stuff of this meeting.
Thanks, Marius. I love the real stuff. So hi everyone. I'm Max Kennel. I'm a senior research associate at the Dr. Gil Arcand Center for Health Equity at the Northern Ontario School of Medicine here in Thunder Bay. I write in the areas of critical theory, political theology, health equity, and recently a book with Brill called Ontologies of Violence. And I'm here today in part representing Pandora Press, which is a small Mennonite publishing company that I direct. I'm also standing in today for another member of our committee, Dr. Laura Schmidt-Roberts, who sends her regrets, and I'm pleased now to introduce our speaker and respondent. So Benjamin Lipscomb is a professor of philosophy and director of the honors program at Houghton University, and he lives with his family in Fillmore, New York, when his teaching doesn't call him to London. In his own words, Ben is an adoptee to this tradition, and in part through his involvement with a small Mennonite house fellowship. And he describes his affiliation, interestingly, I think, in Pauline language of grafting, having been grafted in and having grown with Sojourner's Mennonite, which I'm sure has led to fascinating connections for him and may lead to connections for us. So we're very excited to host this discussion on his new Oxford University Press book, The Women Are Up to Something, How Elizabeth Anscombe, Philippa Foot, Mary Midgley, and Iris Murdoch Revolutionized Ethics. And we're very pleased too to have Peter Dula responding. Peter is professor of religion and culture at Eastern Mennonite University. His PhD is from Duke University in theology and ethics, and he's the author of a book called Cavell, Companionship and Christian Theology, also from Oxford. Before coming to EMU, he was the Mennonite Central Committee Iraq Program Coordinator. And for your interest, he has also recently published an essay on Anabaptist environmental ethics. So in a moment, I'll paste links to these two publications in the chat, but I am happy now to pass it over to Ben to tell us more about his book.
Thanks so much, Maxwell, and really grateful for this invitation, for this opportunity, which I see as a gift. Okay, framing remarks. In early October 1939, the streets of Oxford were unusually quiet. It was the start of term, and ordinarily thousands of students would have been crowding the city's tea shops and bookshops and theaters and lecture halls. But the month before, 84 years and 16 days ago, nearly all of Britain's men between 18 and 41 had been conscripted into military service, joining the thousands who had enlisted the previous spring. The men were mostly gone, but the women stayed. As the men's colleges contracted dramatically, Oxford's 5 women's societies, the 4 women's colleges, and what would become St. Anne's College, at the time the Oxford Society for Home Students, these remained full. And an unexpected outcome of those strange and frightening years was a revolution in thinking about ethics in the Anglophone world, led by a group of women, Elizabeth Anscombe, Philippa Foot, Mary Midgley, and Iris Murdoch, who might not have done what they did if they'd been born a few years earlier, if they'd gone to university in normal times. That revolution and the women who affected it are the subjects of the book. I talk about their intellectual and personal development, their overlapping friendships, and the slow emergence in and through their work of a naturalistic, quote unquote, alternative to the philosophical outlook of their male peers. Most men of their generation, taking cues from the generation preceding, were committed to a picture of the universe as value-free. On that picture, inevitably, ethics becomes something we invent or impose on a value-inert background. Murdoch, Anscombe, Foot, and Midgley, by contrast, converged over time on the idea that our species nature and the qualities that make us or our lives good, that these things are closely connected. That a good life is one in which a person cultivates and exercises characteristically human excellences, virtues. There are endlessly diverse ways to do that. This is not a one-size-fits-all, but it doesn't mean either that there isn't an outline, a shape to the thing, or a family of shapes. These 4 philosophers' collective achievement, as I see it, was that they broke the grip of the value-free dogma and suggested how you might do ethics once you deconstructed that dogma. In preparing for this event, I've vacillated a lot about how much more background than that to assume, how much to supply. A lot of you on this call are here, I think, because you read the book, or that of my friends Rachel Wiseman and Claire McCool about these 4 women. For anyone who hasn't, I'm hoping what I just said will set up the rest of my remarks, will be enough for getting on with, and then more things can come out along the way. But I don't want to take a lot of your time telling you things you already know. What I do want to do at the Anabaptists and Philosophy Roundtable, which I didn't know existed as recently as June of 2022, what I want to do is receive and make appreciative use of a gift, as I said, the highly unusual opportunity that this group represents and presents to think with others about the relationship, if any, between the reflective storytelling that I do in my book and the Christian tradition into which I've been grafted over the past 2 decades. So I think a little more exposition is inevitable. Mostly, as I'm looking around, I think these are people who are regulars at this newly born, recently born thing, but not all. We're at least a somewhat diverse gathering. There might be members of the Iris Murdoch Society who joined this call because Miles Leeson graciously promoted it on their Facebook page. So I'm at least going to mention some salient characteristics of the Anabaptist tradition. Take like 3 minutes for that. Apologies in advance to the more deeply grounded folks from AMBS and elsewhere who would do this better than I would. I guess my best apologia for this is like, if there's something odd about the connections I think I see, maybe it will be grounded in oddnesses and how I think of the tradition that I've been grafted into. Okay, there's too much. But for starters, we're talking about a loose family of communities arising out of the radical reformations of the 16th century, communities united by their repudiation of the church-state nexus, common throughout Europe at the time. Catholic parts, Lutheran parts, Calvinist parts, all over. The radicals rejected this nexus. These people were, as we heard right at the outset of our gathering here, not theoreticians. That's not always been an emphasis in this tradition. A lot of them were peasants. And while some of them grabbed pitchforks and scythes and sought the violent overthrow of the established order that they rejected, most of them turned in time instead to concrete imitation of Jesus and to a pretty radical and unqualified obedience to his instructions. Because Jesus said, don't swear oaths, these people didn't swear oaths, particularly oaths of allegiance. Because Jesus said, turn the other cheek, these people renounced violence. Because Jesus had few possessions and said to be like the lilies of the field and not worry about tomorrow, these people adopted lives of striking simplicity. These were and remain people who are really into doing faith in community with others. I might mention, too, that picking up on the pervasive talk in the New Testament about Christians as siblings, brothers and sisters, Anabaptists are intensely egalitarian. A lot of Protestants use the expression, the priesthood of all believers. What that means is we're not Catholics. We don't have priests, a special caste of people who approach God on our behalf. But a lot of these churches still have pastors uniquely entrusted with overseeing important rituals. Anabaptists, by contrast, think that any Christian can serve the meal that Jesus encouraged his followers to share. Any Christian, if they have the capacity, can teach others, though what they have to say is then subject to the shared discernment of the community. Very flat. Nobody here but us chickens. I'm thinking now of something, seeing Melissa Flora-Bixler on this call. My pastor, Tori, was talking in church on Sunday about something you wrote about pastors being inessential personnel in the church, in the Anabaptist tradition. Yes and no, but I get it. This is deep in this tradition. Finally, because there were people who repudiated the nexus, these were people who repudiated the nexus of sword and altar, the early Anabaptists were frequently perceived as a threat by those who maintained that nexus. They were killed and killed and killed by established authorities through the early years of the movement because they relativized those authorities. So we're a people with a lot of martyr stories for whom those stories are central to our sense of ourselves. Okay, that will have to do. And tell me what I got wrong later, or what you would express differently. I hope that my ongoing formation in this tradition comes out in endless ways in my life and work, increasingly. I confess, though, I thought about it very little, almost not at all, as I wrote the book. Still, since I received this invitation over a year ago, I've been introspecting to see what might be there. I hope this is what this organization wanted for me, but this is what I've come up with. This is what I've been thinking about and what I bring today. Thoughts very much in process. So first, each of these 4 women, Elizabeth Anscombe most of all, But each of them knew intimately what it was to hang on to convictions and practices that set them apart from their peers. And I could tell stories, give for instances about each of them. Let me at least mention a few. Philippa Foot, born to tremendous privilege, to a kind of low-level aristocratic family, living in Yorkshire. She repudiated her family's wealth and connections, wanted nothing to do with that, wanted to do the kind of déclassé thing of going to university, getting an education, entering some professional life. And it was this source of pain and friction between her and her parents' world. Mary Midgley was a protester against nuclear armaments and changes to the British government's attitude toward the academy in the 1980s and other things. Elizabeth Anscombe, as I say, most of all, who the first thing we see from her in terms of philosophical output is a protest pamphlet written with a fellow undergraduate declaring their conviction that, at least according to their public proclamations, the Allies were not going to conduct themselves justly in the upcoming Second World War. And in 1957, she stands virtually alone against her colleagues, denouncing Oxford's giving an honorary degree to former President Harry Truman because of his bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Goes further back than that for her, to when she was an adolescent discovering the Catholic tradition, to the horror of her nominally Anglican parents who wanted her, if she was going to have a conversion, to at least convert to something respectable. And in intensely anti-Catholic mid-century Britain, she went there. These are all people who know what it is to hang on to convictions and practices that set them apart from their peers. Okay, and there's a spiritual courage represented in the martyr stories of the Anabaptist tradition that's reflected too in these philosophers' lives. The impressiveness, more exactly, maybe the integrity, I should say, of their lives is one of the things that drew me to them as subjects. I enjoyed their prose style, I was struck by their ideas, but I was also impressed by them as human beings from before I thought to write about them as a group. And I reflect specifically in the book about Anscombe having the outlook of a martyr. It seems to me self-consciously thinking of herself and her calling and the calling of any Christian in those terms. This goes back to, in the course of her conversion, her reading an account, a book in 2 volumes about the English martyrs of the English Reformation, the Catholic martyrs of the English Reformation. Okay, so that's the first point. Since I admired these philosophers then, one of my guiding questions in the book was how they became who they became. What equipped them to think and to stick to their untimely thoughts and their untimely ways of pursuing their thoughts? Here I might bring up Iris Murdoch, particularly, who some of you might have a special interest in. Murdoch, throughout her career, carried this shame because she was, in Isaiah Berlin's categorization, a hedgehog, someone who wanted to make these large synthetic connections among thinkers in different traditions to see what they had in common. And that kind of elusive synthetic work, though tremendously instructive, was not approved, was not valorized in her milieu, full of foxes, full of people who wanted to pick things apart and see the fine details of how they worked inside. So how did Murdoch become a person who had the courage to proceed as she did? She never let it go, even though she constantly felt self-conscious about it, wondered what people thought. And I've told you stories about the others already. What empowered them for this? One of my conclusions, particularly as regards their philosophical rebellion or revolution, one of my conclusions was that it was the community they had with one another. They had one another's friendship from early on, from their undergraduate years. And Anscombe, in some ways the bravest or of them, or the one who drew on herself the most hostility, also had various sorts of religious community, overlapping networks of fellow Catholics, the Spode House gathering under Father Herbert McCabe, and the interwar, post-war peace group, PAX, that she was a participant in even as an undergraduate. The idea here, an idea that I think we see enacted in our accounts of the early Anabaptist movement, is that when you stand with others, you can stand against the enemies of the thing that you're trying to enact and embody. It's a second point. A third brief point to which we can return in Q&A if we like, depending on what Peter emphasizes in his remarks. The views in ethics toward which Anscombe and Foot especially gravitated, and which constitute one of their legacies, virtue ethics, as it's sometimes called. It's got some resonance with Anabaptist thought and practice. I don't want to overstate this, but many people who have explored an ethics of virtue have been drawn to think about, in Stanley Hauerwas's phrase, a community of character. And I think there's something there. It would be worth exploring more. I'm just going to drop that, but noticing that there might be something. Finally, no, second to last. Fourthly, returning to Anscombe in particular, and focusing on her now. Anscombe was a just war theorist. Indeed, she almost single-handedly brought Catholic just war theorizing out of obscurity back into the philosophical mainstream in mid-century through her protests of British and Allied policy going into the Second World War, through her protests of the honorary degree to Truman. Okay, that's not pacifism. That's not a commitment to nonviolence. And yet, I've thought often about something Hauerwas wrote. I think it was on the eve of the Second Iraq War. He wrote that pacifism and the just war tradition, properly understood, have something crucial in common. I mean, clearly different. The one is about setting up criteria for the legitimate use of lethal force. The other renounces it in favor of various forms of peacemaking and creative conflict transformation. But that both of them, properly understood, have this in common. They are not strategies. They do not promise to advance national ends. They limit the pursuit of such ends. They may indeed bid us to come and die if there's no way to avoid death without loss of integrity, without failing in fidelity. Anscombe gets this. And in some of her essays, I think particularly of War and Murder, she talks about the importance of faithful obedience, whatever the consequences, and about entrusting the outcome of history to the author of the world. Anscombe's thinking about murder is a significant theme in my book. It's by no means the theme of the book, but it's there, and I think in this context, it's especially worth noting. Okay, so last thing. I did think a lot as I was writing this book, particularly as I got near the end, about the practice of biographical research and writing, about how that practice shapes the biographer and one might hope the reader. I intend the term practice here in Alistair MacIntyre's sense, a kind of complex, socially embedded activity that has certain characteristic goods that it makes possible when people commit themselves to trying to excellence in it, when they pursue it, when they throw themselves into it. My view, my experience writing, is that one of what MacIntyre would call the goods internal to the practice of biography is an empathetic, complicating comprehension of one's subjects. I wrote about this explicitly in the book in a long footnote on Anscombe in the final chapter. Anscombe was a really difficult person to be around, as even her friends and students, her closest friends, like Philippa Foot, found her to be. There's this heroism, this intense commitment to the truth and to integrity, and this cussedness and insensibility that were just right there with it. Okay, there's something generically Christian, I think, about striving to see one's subjects as God sees them, in their flawed, beloved individuality, trying to see people that way, and therefore bringing that into the task of biography. If there's something more particularly or specifically Anabaptist here, maybe I could suggest that this is a peacemaking discipline. When I humanly comprehend another, I am to that extent fortified against dehumanizing her in a way that facilitates, that could encourage violence. And so I've been puzzling about that, and I'll be interested in what Peter or the rest of you have to say about that, but I'd better stop.
Thanks, Ben, and thanks to Jamie and Max and Marius and the rest of the committee for organizing this. I'm delighted to be here, and I'll just start by saying that I really love Ben's book. I read it almost as soon as it came out. I heard about it in what seemed like a strange place. Slate Magazine's Culture podcast endorsed it at the end. And if you're like me, you buy or withdraw from the library far more books than you can possibly read. And so don't end up reading very many of them, or not for a very long time. But I opened up Ben's and started reading it and couldn't put it down, and read it through right away. And started evangelizing for it, and started plotting a moral philosophy class around it, all before I discovered that he was a close friend of my colleague here at EMU in digital media, Stephen Johnson, and before I discovered that he went to a little Mennonite fellowship in Houghton. So if you haven't read the book, right, it has this combination of biographical storytelling and philosophical insight without being sort of dense or heavy, with an overall argument about the importance of these four women. And as one way to describe how well it reads is that I was almost to the end of it before I realized that I had some fundamental disagreements with it. So I don't know if fundamental is the word, but he made me forget that I'm not an ethical naturalist. And so I thought maybe what I could do here in my 10 minutes is kind of explain sort of what that means, make a attempt to connect that to Anabaptism, and then sort of say why the women are up to something has made me second guess it a little bit. So, and there's lots of other things to say, which maybe we'll get to in the conversation. But so I am just as troubled by and opposed to the positivism that sort of dominated mid-century moral philosophy, and that Anscombe and Midgley and Foot and Murdoch all play a significant role in dethroning. I'm just as frustrated by the fact-value dichotomy that they tried to undermine. I don't know if that means I need to be an ethical naturalist. So I take it an ethical naturalist is someone who thinks that human beings, given the kinds of things they are by nature, need the virtues. So Anscombe's husband, Peter Geach, said humans need virtues the way bees need stings. So these four women in Ben's telling kind of turn to nature as a way to overcome the arbitrary subjectivism of those mid-century moral philosophers. It's nature, or it's at best arbitrary subjectivism, at worst naked capitalist self-interest. But there's lots of there's other paths to be taken, right? And I'm curious what you think of them, Ben. I'm tempted to just call those alternatives pragmatism, except that the people I have most in mind would refuse the term. So John McDowell or Sophie Grace Chappell or Stanley Cavell, or even the pre-dependent rational animals McIntyre. That is the kind of thinkers I have in mind share the conviction that you overcome arbitrary subjectivism not by an appeal to nature, but by an appeal to what they might call social practices or ordinary language or grammar. So to put it in terms of Anscombe and Foot, it seems to me, and I should have said this right at the outset, I'm here, I guess, because I like Ben's book so much, not because I'm an expert on any of these four women. But so Anscombe kind of famously has this argument against David Hume's is-ought distinction, which of course is closely related to the fact-value distinction, or just is the fact-value distinction. And she says in her sort of characteristically mocking way, and she says this twice, right? Both in two early essays, on brute facts, and then she repeats it in Modern Moral Philosophy. Suppose I suppose I request a delivery from the grocer of a sack of potatoes, and the grocer sends me the potatoes and sends me a bill. And then I turn around and tell the grocer that you can't get from the is of the fact that those potatoes are now in my kitchen, not in his store, to the ought of I owe you money. It's sort of characteristically Anscombean mockery, and I don't know, the point is not to claim it as or not to evaluate it as a critique of Hume, except to say it seems to me like a sort of pragmatist argument, right? The facts in question here are facts of our language use within the practices of buying and selling with particular currencies. And so if you don't understand that this ought follows from that is, then it's not that you know something about truth conditions, it's that you're alien to our form of life, as Wittgenstein might put it. Now later then in Modern Moral Philosophy, she has that weird thing about just as humans have so many teeth, then we need the virtues. I don't quite understand that bit, but anyhow, it seems to me the same thing is true with Philippa Foot, right? In those early essays, and Ben really lucidly summarizes Foot on words like rudeness and dangerous in order to show that if you don't understand that the words rude and dangerous entail evaluative content, then you just don't understand the grammatical criteria of those words. Now, later she comes to think that that's not enough, right? That she's going to need to ground this in something more than our context-dependent practices of language use, but in nature. And I'm not sure why. I'm not sure why she doesn't think that's enough. So I would say just maybe say, I want to say why I don't think it's enough, and then say why or why I do think it's enough, and then maybe say why, what I've learned from Ben's book about why I might be wrong about that. And this is the place where I do my own attempt to connect this to Anabaptism, and to one of our host institutions, AMBS, where I learned much of what I know theologically about what it is to be an Anabaptist. Not to throw my home church under the bus, but to say this all too crudely and schematically, I learned, and this is also to say that this doesn't mean that's what I was taught, right? There's a difference between what you learn and what you're taught, as all of us teachers know. But I was trained to think that to be an Anabaptist is to be a Bartian. What I mean by that is that I learned to think of Barth's radical refusal of authorities other than Scripture. Right? So Ben sort of made this clear in the beginning, right? The rejection of authority that he seemed to be thinking of as the magistrates. Rejection of also any authorities like nature. As Ben also put it, they read Jesus said, so they did it. They read Jesus said, love your enemies, so they did it. That didn't need any grounding in anything other than the simple Jesus said. So as I learned to sort of deploy Barth's arguments against natural theology in a defense of a radical Christological ethic that didn't need to worry about the fact that, to put it in Aristotelian terms, opens up a pretty wide gap or tension between telos and eudaimonia, between our end and flourishing. So I want to be clear that I do not mean to defend that view either as a sort of privileged account of Anabaptism. I'm not even sure I want to defend it as what I currently think. But what I'm trying to do is kind of root my sort of the biases in my own intellectual history that make me more sympathetic to what I sort of timidly called the pragmatists and less sympathetic to what I called the ethical naturalists. So I hope that made sense. But so, I mean, I said earlier that I consider Ben's enemies, or these women's enemies, as much my enemies. And I mentioned Ayer's positivism and Hare's subjectivism and Stevenson's emotivism and Dawkins' atheism. But the one thing I left out, the bigger bit, was what Ben calls the billiard ball picture of the universe. So I take it what's at stake. So the billiard ball universe, that we are, in the end, just matter in motion. We are just atoms in the void, fundamentally. It's a basic picture inherited from modern science. What the pragmatists allow you to do is maintain a kind of modus vivendi with that picture, right? That picture doesn't need to be troubled, right? You get this space between empirical, hard scientific description and what Sellers called the logical space of reasons. That we may just be meaningless dark matter in the void, but we have this distinctive human capacity for practices of giving and receiving reasons that allow us to have a perspective on what it means to be atoms in the void. So what I take that Ben wants us to learn from these four women is that maybe that's too high of a price to pay. And maybe we, as speaking as what I'm calling pragmatists, are giving up too early. And that there are real, not just philosophical, but maybe scientific possibilities of re-enchanting the world that are being overlooked by the pragmatist picture. So that's kind of my overall sort of initial major reaction to the book, which it took me a while to come to. And I think maybe I'll just leave it there instead of rambling on more, and we can talk about other stuff in the discussion. Does that all make sense there, Ben? Yeah.
Yeah, so should I say anything, or do you want to open up in conversation and let things come out as they will? Who's emceeing?
Yeah, Ben, feel free to respond.
Okay, very briefly, because I want to leave as much time as possible for ongoing conversation, perhaps on these very points. I'm intrigued by the lesson that Peter took away from his seminary training to be an Anabaptist is to be Bardian. I hadn't heard it put like that. It makes sense as you spell it out. Jesus said, so we do, full stop, no need for a grounding. And what does one need a grounding for? I think Anscombe, not because she's a pragmatist in your sense, because I think she thinks of the form of life of the human being that includes all of these language practices as being an expression of distinctive aspects of the species form of life, so that there isn't a separation between our language using selves and our natural species selves, but we need an articulation of our species selves that includes this linguistic stuff. But certainly her attitude on these matters of war and murder is you don't need to be given a justification. Sometimes you'll read the words of Jesus and you do, understanding or not understanding. The authority is there regardless. She didn't think just anyone could say this. She thought you kind of had to be a Christian in order to think that that way of talking about ethics made sense. But I'm thinking back to the remarks that Marius made at the very beginning of our time together about we haven't always been a theoretically oriented tradition, and we're trying to pull people together around a kind of conversation that we think can be a blessing, but that has sometimes been regarded with suspicion or at least deprioritized. You don't need the grounding to obey. You do maybe need the grounding in order to give the most satisfactory account of what it is that you're obeying. And one can hope to be brought into a position of seeing more luminously what the goodness is of what it is that we are told to do. That one doesn't just have it as a absurd thing forever, love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you, but that the God who says through Jesus, I've come to bring life to you, abundant life, that this is abundant life in an unexpected way, that this is flourishing, being eudaimon, that's a more satisfying thing to say if you are taking up this little inessential but maybe humanly inevitable task of theoretically inframing our doings in the world. And I think that's what I think too about the last point you made, and then I'll shut up. That Sellers and others who are proposing theoretical quietism, let's believe in the value-free universe and then have this other discursive space in which we don't bring it up. I think one of the lessons I take from these women is that there's a dogma here that merits being challenged, that it's accepting too quickly a kind of unsynthesizability of our view of the world and our view of ourselves. And I'll stop. Thank you so much for the thought you put into this, Peter.
Wonderful presentation, Ben, and thanks for your thoughtful responses and counterpoints and musings, Peter. I'm happy now to open it to the floor, and in the spirit of the book, let me give priority to women in the audience. I see someone has raised a hand. Let me just pull up the participants list here. All right, go for it.
Are you talking to me? I wasn't sure.
I am.
Okay. I sorry, I didn't know that the priority worked that way. Sorry. So, and I'm not sure why my name says my son's video game tag. It just shows he controls every part of my life. Anyways, thank you all for hosting this. It's really great to see friends. Jamie, I haven't seen you for a while. Thank you for sending the invite to this. So I had a question for both Professor Lipscomb and Peter, I guess pushing in both different directions. So Professor Lipscomb, I'm ashamed to say I haven't read your book. I think it was like top on my list. And then maybe I came across the Alice Crary Boston review of it. The gist of which is it's really great work, but it's missed opportunities in terms of kind of landing things in terms of ordinary language philosophy. And I'm enough of an OLP snob to be swayed by that. But I think I'm like Peter and wanting to learn from and having had thoughts in recent years about this. So I want to ask the question. This would go in Peter's direction of what's enough. You talked about justification and grounding, and what do you think about the distinction to say that justifying a claim is not the same as grounding, where justifying is mostly what we need. It proves satisfying in most cases along the lines of what you said. And justifying isn't simply what we say, but it could also include things like what we think God says. But that's what we mean by this, what we say God says or something like that. So I wonder about that distinction for you, whether it works, what the limitations are. And Peter, I want to ask you, I'm sympathetic too to the hesitation about naturalistic ethics, but also open to ways that folks have tried to think about this in recent years, especially having learned from Cavell. They often take this from moments within Cavell itself, that fascinating and utterly difficult chapter on natural and conventional, where he talks about the general features of human life, where he's very nervous with the language of mere convention. But also folks like Stephen Mulhall have pushed this in a certain kind of way. Gene Porter's account of formal causality. These are all ways that I think are sympathetic to you, but also maybe with you want to push closer to some kind of naturalism. That's a question for both of you. I don't know if you each have time to respond. Thank you.
Peter, you want to go first, since it's freshly that bit?
Okay, thanks, Jonathan. I've got to admit, I was really confused by the combination of that face I recognize and that username. So good to see it was who I thought it was. So Yeah. So one thing that, I mean, part of the reason I was hesitant about that term pragmatism is that Cavell is very clear that when he says form of life, he doesn't mean what lots of people take him to mean, like sort of particular cultures or communities, but he means the human form of life. And that is grounded in nature. I thought you were going to also add, maybe Alice Crary or people like that. So I'll say one, I'm very sympathetic about it. Two, I thought it'd be tediously predictable for me to talk about Cavell today. But also I'm interested, so my understanding of most basic understanding of philosophy that I inherited from Wittgenstein and Cavell is that philosophy needs to be available to anyone, right? It can't only be the province of experts with specific knowledge. So to the degree that these things about the human form of life, the human species, are pre-theoretical, sort of pre-scientific, which I think, there's an argument to be made for that about Foot, then I am in total sympathy and a lot of agreement, right? It's when they require sort of biological or zoological expertise not available to the anyone who wants to do philosophy. That's when I get a little nervous. Then that's when I feel like it's gone past what I think of as Wittgenstein and Cavell and Austin's philosophical bequest. I don't know if that answers the question, but
and I'll jump on here. It's partly reiterating, but maybe trying to do better, something I said immediately after Peter's remarks. It's one thing I'm going to try to avoid what could be taken as terms on either side of a technical distinction, justifying, grounding. But I'm going to say one can be satisfactorily moved to act or obey and yet not have a luminous account with which to live of what one's doing and how it fits into a wider imagined world that one inhabits. And these are both human needs at different levels, to have enough to be getting on with and for things to make sense and connect for us. Peter's remarks put me in mind of something that Mary Midgley says that I like very much. She was, among other things, a public philosopher, more so than any of her cluster of friends and peers. And she likened philosophy to plumbing, said that we get these kinks and blockages in our thought, and in some cases, they can only be of concern to the people whose kinks and blockages they are. But sometimes when a kind of pattern of thought will naturally lead people on to conclusions that are false or destructive, or confining, bad in some way of several possible ways, then we need to look at how did we get there? How did this framing, how did this assumption, how did this metaphor sort of colonize our thinking or plug it up, to stay with plumbing? And I think that the move that these philosophers are making toward a kind of naturalism can be expressed in Midgleyan terms. as trying to give us a more coherent and luminous way of talking about how our doing well in our human lives relates to our picture of reality generally.
Fascinating set of questions, Jonathan. And thanks for your response, Peter. And Ben, I'm wondering if there's anyone else who has a burning question. Marius, I'm going to hold off for a second to give others from the crowd a chance, but we'll move to you next if no one else has something in the chamber. All right, Marius, floor is yours.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you both of you for these really rich talks. Google is lowering my hand automatically. Isn't that great? I was Professor Lipscomb. I was particularly enthused by the stories you told about these 4 women. So I haven't had a chance to read the book. And a lot of the subject that you've talked about today are not my field of expertise, but I was quite impressed also by the stories that you told about repudiating parents' wealth and writing protest pamphlets and becoming Catholic. And one thing that they all have in common is that they're all stories of discontinuity. That the practices that set them apart, as you called it, are connected to these stories of discontinuity. I'm just wondering on how that relates to the sort of the ethical naturalism that seems to be a story of continuity between our species nature and virtues. Right? Like in these biographical stories, there seems to be really a choice, a moment of choice against sort of the givenness that these women are placed in. Whereas the ethical naturalism seems to embrace a sort of, at least to some extent, a continuity with the givenness that we find ourselves in. I don't know if that question makes any sense. If it doesn't, please.
It's a great prompt to
yes,
say more things and to puzzle a little bit out loud. I want to say, first of all, the familial ruptures that characterized the emerging adulthood of Foot and Anscombe both were not there for Midgley and Murdoch. Murdoch, the only child of her parents, had this cocooning kind of relationship to her family, and it was intensely traumatic when she first went away to boarding school. There's a deep bond there that went on and on. And Midgley, though she left behind the faith, the Anglican faith of her parents, nonetheless remained intensely admiring of them. I should say Tom Scruton was involved from the Anglican side with a kind of Anglican-Quaker alliance during the interwar period. He's as much a social campaigner as a fairly well-known rector in his time, and their politics and their service to their neighbors, she found it all really humane, even as she characterized prayer and religious devotion as like a machine that she couldn't get to work. Didn't know what buttons to push to make anything happen. Nevertheless, in different ways, they all are in discontinuity with certainly their professional peers. As I said in my opening remarks, it matters so much that they found some people to stand with at the same time. It means so much not to be made to feel like one is hallucinating or not putting together sums correctly. And they had that with one another. They had that with certain other key mentors or family members. And it makes such a difference. It makes all the difference. Nonetheless, let me put it this way. Anscombe was a person, especially Foot too, but Anscombe above all, who knew viscerally the meaning of those hard sayings of Jesus about being set against your mother and father and brothers and sisters. And I had something else and now it's fleeing from me. Marius. This is one of the, I know what I want to say. This is one of the qualities that our individual and communal human goodness depends upon, is a kind of courage to say difficult things to one another, to not simply be carried along into whatever humdrum or spectacular wickednesses that crowds sometimes perpetrate. And so I think there, I see the point of the question, but I think there's that there's a way of expressing how this is deeply in line with a view like Anscombe's and Foot's, to say for human beings to thrive individually and together, they have to be equipped, prepared, braced, habituated to do things that are dangerous to them, socially, physically, and this gets expressed in part in some of the stories that I told about Anscombe, for instance, or Foot, to be able to see that something is good and not let go of that because people around you are wrinkling their noses or worse. I take her as a challenge to me. I have wondered how I would behave in some of the circumstances in which she found herself.
Fascinating reflections on how familial ruptures and the breaking or straining of social bonds plays into all of what we've been discussing. Are there others who would like to ask questions to Ben? Perhaps while we wait for anyone to form questions, I'll note. So, like perhaps like Murray, I'm unfamiliar with some of the basic source material for this. I was schooled in continental philosophy, and so I come from a different place. But I've been reading critical theorists who situate themselves in the lineage of the Frankfurt School recently, and so when I hear about forms of life, my first thought went to this fascinating book by Rahel Yegi called Critique of Forms of Life. You may find it interesting. I've posted a link in the chat. And as well, when I hear about the fact-value distinction and the kind of sassy potato example, I'm thinking of Rainer Forst's work on normativity and power. I wonder if you might illuminating. I'll post a link in the chat on that book in a moment. Do we have anyone else? I see Jamie's hand. We'll go to him in a moment, but I want to hold space for anyone in our small audience to field questions. Now's the time. There's that pause. Okay, Jamie, over to you. Oh, I see Laura as well. Up to you, Jamie, whether you want to defer to Laura or how you want to.
I'll defer to Laura, thanks.
There you go. Over to you, Laura. Oh, I think you are muted.
Well, I'm totally outclassed by this group of people. I haven't studied this in way too many years. But one of the things that I was thinking about as we were talking about the Anabaptists leaning into the practical and leaning into, this is what Jesus said, let's do it. Let's not think too hard about how we might explain it away. You write in your book, Ben, about Mary Midgley kind of taking a long time to just live before she steps into philosophy. is there anything you could say about kind of the connections between the way that she lived and what she wrote, and kind of that practical vision of the Mennonite or Anabaptist tradition?
Oh, this is great, Lara, because like Midgley embodies, it might seem very odd to some people to think of Midgley as moving to the margins because she moved to a different university town than Oxford. And yet, from the point of view of everyone whose opinions would most be relayed to her within her professional set, it was a choice to self-marginalize when she and Jeff, her husband, went up to Newcastle, right as she's in postgraduate years. And she felt the lack of respect, including sometimes from friends like Philippa Foot, for where she'd been, the kinds of conversations she'd been a part of, the kind of thinking that she'd been led toward. But there are things she could see from the margins by making this somewhat countercultural choice, by pursuing, very like Murdoch this way. Murdoch was interested in these intersections between continental and Anglo-American thought, and most people were genially dismissive or worse of what wasn't Anglophone, and she's trying to put it together and see where the convergences lie. And that's fruitful if you can stick with it while people are making fun of you. And Midgley, it's kind of a similar story. She's determined to both see her boys out of the house to secondary school and determined to figure out what she thinks about the intersections of philosophy and biology that she'd started to read more and more and more about, because she's like Aristotle. She's intellectually omnivorous, interested in everything and how it fits together. And only by doing this thing that certainly didn't get her any respect in professional circles was she able to do the thing that she did. And it's not as splashy. It was more of a cross to carry. I don't mean day to day in the doing of diapers, though I suppose that too, but it was more of a cross in that Anscombe at least got letters from overseas from people who were impressed by and admiring of her defiance of the Oxford Honorary Degree Committee. Midgley just went on with her life, not knowing where it was leading and gradually accumulating the point of view to write a book like Beast and Man.
Thanks very much for your question and response. Over to you, Jamie. What do you have for us?
Thanks. I'm really enjoying this discussion. It's very much what I had in mind and hoped for with this collection of people. So really grateful. Back to the naturalism question. I was interested as well in your narrative, Ben, in your book, that sort of all four of these women kind of they reject this value-free picture and ask critical questions, but you, if I'm reading you correctly, you really position Midgley as the one who kind of offers the most complete alternative picture with this naturalism. And that's Midgley's solution is definitely not all four of these women's solution, but there's been in this conversation some kind of assumption that naturalism is a fitting description for all of them. And I was most surprised that Murdoch was supportive at all of Midgley, because she's the one who seems to be the most non-naturalistic and a resource. However, I'll just say, to complete that sentence, a resource for thinking about, as Wittgenstein said, the good as not part of the space of facts. But like Wittgenstein, Murdoch wants us to pay very close attention to what she calls the texture of being. So it's not a kind of either a pure shift to speculation, nor is it a kind of ethical obedientism on a certain strain of Anabaptism, but it does entail close attention to people, to social practices, and so forth, in a way that could be complementary to what someone like Midgley does, and yet is more insistent on the otherness of the good. I just would invite you or others to comment on that as a kind of alternative to the naturalism that Midgley represents.
I really appreciate your word complementary here, Jamie. That this is how I view the somewhat overlapping and somewhat divergent philosophical projects in ethics of these four. That they have no manifesto. They are not consciously, a little bit Foot and Anscombe at a certain point in the late 50s, and then Foot late in her life as she's putting together her one and only monograph, very explicitly, like, how do I bring to fruition a set of ideas that I got from and associate with my friend? But there's a lot of independence, a lot of mere suggestive overlap and fruitful interaction. What I've been saying in some conversations about this is that there's an implicit common project, and you can characterize it as opening up a space for different kinds of reflection than there would have been space for previously. And that space is broadly naturalistic, but boy, there's different forms that can take, and maybe forms that it would be a stretch to call naturalistic at all. I will say a couple of words about Murdoch in particular. That she and Foot, I mean, all four of them in the late 1940s, when they're still hanging around Oxford, are having conversations about virtue terms and other terms that seem hard to fit into the views of language that their male peers went in for, the picture of the world that their male peers went in for. And it's Foot and Murdoch working together who teach a graduate seminar on virtues and vices in, I think, 1954. So she's very interested in that vocabulary and its implications, and goes on using virtue positively as a term in her thinking. But I think what I think of most of all when I think of the affinity between Murdoch and some sort of very broadly conceived ethical naturalism is the stuff she says in her post-Oxford essays that she's best known for in philosophical circles, gathered under the title The Sovereignty of Good, where she's talking approvingly about Freud. She says, look, Freud was wrong about so many things, but he gives us this vivid, convicting picture of the mechanism of human motivation, of all of this self-centered energy that's within us and that we don't understand and that we can't fully control. And she says, and which means we need to think about what practices, communal practices, individual practices, what are the ways in which one can stop this mechanism from simply having its way with you and leading you to behave abominably? And I think she's speaking out of really painful personal experience here, because she's a person who's hard on herself about ways in which she's behaved abominably in her own mind in some of the intimate relationships in her life. And she carries that. And in her fiction, this is this constant theme: people with their self-centered occlusions treating one another terribly, not being able to see one another or relate to one another lovingly and justly. And so she's thinking about the human animal. Like, what is the mechanism of the self? What is our motivational structure? And what are the forms of habituation or communal support that can prevent us from becoming our worst selves? Does she think that we need to set our eyes on something thoroughly transcending ourselves in order to aspire most fitly? Yes, she does. Is she fascinated in a wistful way that she doesn't really want to commit to in Plato's Form of the Good? Yes. I don't deny any of this. But there's a kinship there that it would be possible to miss. She is really interested, actually, in the human animal, how the human animal is put together and works, and what sorts of formation are necessary for us.
Wonderful. I see a hand from Mary Sprunger-Froese, and I see two people on the screen, so perhaps we'll have two questions.
No, this is from Peter, actually.
Thank you both, Jamie and Ben, for your comments at the end. My question will try to pick up with that, somewhat based on my experience, basically day to day in this world in Colorado Springs. Very conservative, very militaristically oriented. I find myself accepting the mystery of the human being as a starting point. But that said, I find most critical in how I will determine my attitude to this disagreeing, this enemy stranger before me who would like to kill me. When I say we don't need to kill each other and we can all be pacifists and so on. This stance of mine says God is love. We are, first of all, in our essence, we are all human beings created for love and desiring love. And however much that has been shrouded and cloaked over and whitewashed by our cultural conditionings, I'm not going to let the cultural conditionings hold sway on this matter. I will forever look at that of God in this person who's ready to kill me. And I will try my best, however creative or the lack thereof in me, to find that of God in that person. So invariably, that might mean me asking, tell me more about that. This or that thing in your last two sentences is quite intriguing, because I know we humans are prone to distortion in a very fundamental way, but we also have amazing capacity for conversion, amazing capacity to change and to begin to taste what that essence, that core called love is about. And so how do we best, unearth that more core essence that we like to justify in one way or another, whether with Augustinian inherent evil or with something more Pelagian that says we're all essentially good? And let's pull at it.
That is so large, but also beautiful. Thank you for this. I'll be too brief with this because there's too much to say. One of my favorite lines in the writings of Iris Murdoch, we were just talking about.
Yeah.
She says, "Love is the extremely difficult realization that someone other than yourself is real."
Right.
And I think about this a lot, and it is what I was going after with some of my remarks about biography as a practice that we can adopt even if we're not writing biographies. not so long ago read a wonderful novel, Francis Spufford's Light Perpetual. And there's this scene near the end where a character is standing on a subway platform in London, looking around at the faces. Maybe you've had this experience come to you sometimes, where he just is struck by the fact that this whole life stands behind each of these faces.
Yes.
I am like them in my fallibility, in the kind of sympathy that I have for myself, that at least sometimes I make sense to myself, even in my worst moments. And in our finitude, we can't pursue this thought with every single person we pass on the sidewalk or in public transit. And yet, biography is a discipline in picking some subjects and doing this. And my hope is that it's also habituating.
Yeah. Great. Thank
Thank you, Ben. With 6 minutes left, I'll pass it over to Melissa.
Hi, thanks. Well, Ben, I love this book, not for the philosophy, but for like the female fantasy of all the men being sent off to war and the women just getting to go think about things together. Like, I guess, like men think about the Roman Empire every day, and this is what we think about. So thank you for just allowing that space. And even as we were talking, I was like, oh right, there's philosophy happening here, because this is a biography, which is sort of where my question I think intersects with sort of what Peter was sharing. What can biographies like this do, and what can't they do in terms of engagement with the philosophical question? Is the intention to reshape sort of how we think about moral philosophy because it is emerging from the particularity of these lives and these experiences, or are there sort of separate questions happening here? So yeah, I think the question is just a little bit more about like I love gossip, but what is the intention for that shaping our moral imaginations through this work?
Thanks for the kind words and for a good question here. Okay. In terms of my own hoping to shift a conversation in philosophical circles, there's a promotional aspect to foregrounding people, or foregrounding a way of taking the work of a group of people that hasn't always been attended to. By showing them side by side, maybe we see things about them and they will acquire a salience in the conversation. But that's maybe the lesser way of taking the question. That is there, this is the way I'm taking it, Melissa, is there a connection between the ideas and the lives that makes them so that they don't tidily separate? It's not just like having told these stories, having interested people in the gossip, of which there's loads, and I love it too, then they'll pay attention to the ideas, and that will be good. It'll be a nice vehicle, spoonful of sugar. But is it tighter than that? You'll remember from the book, Mary Midgley, like the one thing she wrote for the BBC that got spiked by her producer was this piece called Rings and Books, in which she says, I think it matters that the canonical philosophers are bachelors, that there are all these unmarried men who don't make lives with others that are necessarily lives of compromise, who aren't sharing a household and the life and work of a household. And she says, I think Aristotle has married opinions versus Plato, who has sort of adolescent male opinions. I've been puzzling about it ever since I first read that piece. I do think that in various ways, the marginal characteristics of these women's lives and the admirableness of these women's lives in their different venues helps us to take them more seriously. Not just like I give them PR and then people read them and say, oh yeah, that's good philosophy, but that we are interested in whether someone who writes about how to live has made any progress in living themselves. And some of their own ways of life are, to me, partial, incomplete, but partial validations of the things that they're saying. I take it more seriously, whether I should or shouldn't. Some people would think of this as the genetic fallacy, but I take it more seriously in the way that sometimes when I see someone heroically, sacrificially peacemaking, I think, okay, yeah, this thing about being empowered by the Spirit and by the community, the body of Christ, that's real. That's a thing that I can see happening in the world, because look at that there. Some swirling thoughts in response to, again, a good question that deserves more than I can give it here.
That's a wonderful tie-in with some of the themes from our very first session with Diane Enns, where she spoke of the importance of biography for her philosophical work. And so I'll pass it over to Jamie to conclude us and to invite us along for further discussion. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks to Max for hosting, to Ben and Peter for these stimulating input, and for all of those who participated. This is an occasional online series that, as I mentioned, Institute of Mennonite Studies at the Mennonite Seminary here in Elkhart, Indiana, is now taking some hosting responsibilities for, in terms of posting things online and sharing the link to this. So this has been recorded, and we will share a link. I've just put a link to the AMBS webpage where this will be. We have not updated this since the handover to Institute of Mennonite Studies, but we will be doing that, so keep an eye out from there. I sent an email to a group of people who had signed up for our previous events. We're going to eventually be migrating that list into a like a MailChimp email thing. If you would like to be part of that and like to receive more information about these events, please do send me an email at jpitts@ambs.edu. It's also there in the chat. And we are, just to say, we are planning a spring event around Judith Butler's The Force of Nonviolence, probably a little symposium around that book. We would love for you to come. If you are interested, you're obviously here, so you're interested in this conversation. If you have ideas about future events, would like to share some of your work or be part of a conversation, we'd love to hear from you. So again, feel free to email me at jpitts@ambs.edu. I think that's it. Again, thanks, and the link will go out. But let's end by expressing our gratitude to Ben and Peter. Bye, everyone. Thanks again.